No one expected Jason Statham sitting silently in the corner of the restaurant to stand up. But when he saw the injustice, he didn't stay silent. What he said silenced an entire room. And what happened next changed that young waiter's life forever. Stay until the end, because this story isn't about fame, it's about humanity. And when it's over, you might realize that the hero of this story could be you. The restaurant wall clock showed 9:17 p.m. when Daniel adjusted for the fourth time the tie that never quite fit him right. It was too thin for the worn collar of his white shirt, which had already seen too many nights. The reflection in the kitchen mirror revealed a young man in his 20s, shoulders hunched. Not from age, but from the invisible weight of a life that never gave him a break. Outside the dining room of Élysée, one of London's most expensive and elite restaurants, shone like a separate universe. Crystals sparkled, soft laughter floated like background music, and dishes with French names paraded across tables like untouchable works of art. Everything there existed to make one thing clear: some belong, and others are merely there to serve. Daniel was in the second group. His shift had started at 5 in the evening, but as usual, he preferred to arrive an hour early. The manager never noticed, the customers never knew, but that extra hour was the one moment Daniel allowed himself to breathe. In the still empty kitchen, among the hum of refrigerators and the dormant scent of spices, he could remember who he was, or at least, who he wanted to be. It was his second job of the day. In the morning, he delivered packages on a rented bike. At night, he wore shoes that tore his heels to serve wine he'd never tasted to people who wouldn't remember his face 5 minutes later. That night, an important reservation had been made in advance. A well-known name, a man who graced magazine covers, featured on Billionaire lists, and dominated headlines that wore success like a crown. He was set to arrive at 9 p.m., and he wasn't coming alone. When the entourage walked in, the atmosphere adjusted to receive them. The waiters straightened their backs. The hostess forced a smile. And Daniel, with eyes downcast and tray steady in his hands, knew that table would be his. The man sat like a weary king, burdened by too much power. The others around him, executives, investors, local celebrities, laughed before he even spoke. That was the kind of presence that commanded laughter, even in silence. Daniel approached with millimetric precision, posture aligned, calm voice, eyes on the glass, never on the soul. That's how he survived. But that night, a slip was waiting. While pouring sparkling water for one of the guests, the bottle slipped slightly on the rim of the glass. A splash, small, almost invisible, landed on the host's sleeve. Time suspended itself for a second. Then came the silence. The man looked at the droplet as if it carried poison, then at Daniel with the calculated disdain of someone accustomed to slowly destroying others. "Negligence has a scent, and I can smell yours from here." The phrase was spoken like poison poured into crystal. The table chuckled, a timid laugh, complicit, hidden behind napkins and diverted eyes. Daniel apologized, head bowed. His voice didn't come out. It didn't need to. They should train you people better. Or maybe choose better who they let serve here. The problem isn't the drop, it's who's holding the bottle. Those words weren't spoken to Daniel. They were thrown for everyone to hear, to brand him, like red wine on a white cloth. The laughter returned, this time less timid. Someone discreetly recorded with a phone, a meme in the making, a humiliation that, with just a few clicks, would travel continents. Daniel didn't know where to place his hands. Sweat trickled down his back and his face burned. But he didn't cry. Not out of pride, but because crying there, on that marble floor, in front of people who saw him as a walking mistake, would mean accepting that they were right. The billionaire reclined in his chair, satisfied. His gesture had been fulfilled. He had shown the world he still ruled, that his value remained intact. Daniel exited the scene with silent steps, walking across the dining room like a ghost. But someone was watching him. In the corner of the restaurant near the wall of wines, a man sitting alone at a small table had witnessed everything. His eyes didn't show shock or surprise. They revealed something deeper, a kind of recognition. He didn't record, didn't comment. He just kept his eyes fixed on Daniel as he disappeared into the kitchen. In the staff area, Daniel washed his hands for the third time, trying to erase a guilt that wasn't his. The other waiters exchanged glances but said nothing. They had all been through something similar. They all knew silence was safer. But inside, Daniel was crumbling. It wasn't the first humiliation, but this one hurt differently. Maybe because it was public. Maybe because he was too tired to defend himself. Or maybe just because it hurt. Outside, dinner continued. The lights, the toasts, the conversations about unreachable figures. But the man in the corner remained still. He finished his wine with the calm of someone who knew the value of time. The lines on his face said more than words. His strong arms folded across his chest said he wasn't there by accident. His name was Jason Statham. For years he had played heroes who broke down doors, saved lives, and faced evil with fists. But there that night, sitting in silence, he knew the real enemy was something else, more subtle, more real, the kind that feeds on arrogance and disguises itself as power. Jason had once been Daniel, not with a white uniform and a tray, but with the shame. The feeling that the world spun for others, never for him. He too had served tables, carried boxes, slept on cold floors. And he too had been humiliated by men in expensive suits. But that night he wasn't there to remember. He was there to act. The restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had changed. Like an electric cloud no one could see, but everyone could feel. Jason finished his wine, placed the napkin on the table with near ritualistic precision, and then stood up. The manager noticed from afar. His eyes said, "Please don't make a scene." But it was too late. Jason was already walking toward the billionaire's table. There was no rush in his steps, no anger on his face, only presence. A presence that filled the air. And at that exact moment, between a raised glass and a frozen laugh, everyone realized this wasn't just interference. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Jason now stood before the table. The billionaire looked at him with the same smug smile he gave everyone, a smile of superiority. But in that instant, for the first time that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Vulnerability. Jason had always known what it meant to be invisible. Maybe that's why over time he learned to observe the world like someone decoding secret signals in silence. He grew up in narrow streets with harsh accents and broken promises. His father used to say that when you're born without privilege, the world teaches you quickly to lower your eyes, or harden them. Jason did both. In childhood, his house was more noise than home. Screams sliced through the walls like blades. The smell of burning food was common, not from carelessness, but because pots were forgotten while his mother tried to cover sadness with expired makeup. His father, absent when not too present, treated his children like burdens to endure. Jason grew up hungry, but not just for food. He was hungry for respect, for voice, for peace. As a teenager, he washed dishes in restaurants where he wasn't even allowed to be seen. He was a ghost who cleaned up others' messes and vanished before the day broke. Once, he heard a chef say, "If you want to be respected, learn to keep your mouth shut first." Jason never forgot. When he finally left that house, he walked out with nothing in his pockets, not even a strong last name. All he carried was a hardened gaze far too intense for his age, and strength in his shoulders that didn't come from muscles, but from surviving. Years later, that same look ended up on cinema screens. But the truth is, Jason never really acted. He simply allowed the world to see what life had already carved into him. The roughness of the character, the restrained rage, the silent way of handling chaos. None of it was fiction, it was memory. That night at the Élysée, Jason was just having dinner, or at least that's what people thought. He wore a dark shirt, sleeves rolled up, scruffy beard. He looked like any ordinary man, and he liked that. Anonymity for him was a luxury, but that wasn't what made him dangerous. What made Jason dangerous was what he carried inside. He noticed the waiter, Daniel, before the incident even happened. There was something about the young man that made Jason observe a little longer than usual. The way he looked at his own feet, the way he held the tray with tense fingers. Jason recognized those movements. They came from a place he knew too well, the constant fear of making a mistake when the world offers you no room to make one. So when the drop hit the billionaire's sleeve and all eyes turned on the young man like blades, Jason already knew what was about to happen. The billionaire would speak with cruelty. The laughter would follow. The shame would spread like a slow, corrosive wave. And Daniel would stand there, frozen, trying to pretend it didn't hurt. But Jason felt it. Not out of empathy, but because of memory. He didn't get up immediately. He watched how the gazes slipped away from the waiter, how people chose to laugh or pretend they hadn't seen anything. And in that moment, Jason realized what truly moved him that night. It wasn't justice, it was rescue. Because somewhere in the past he had been Daniel, and no one had stood up for him. But now, he could be the voice he never had, the presence that had been missing, the lighthouse in the middle of someone else's storm. The dining room tried to keep its rhythm, forks clinking, glasses raised, chatter forced into normalcy. But the air had changed. Everyone knew something was coming, even if they couldn't name it. Jason stood slowly, his jacket still on the chair, hands in his pockets. Every step carried weight. The tension didn't come from sound, it came from the absence of it. The silence became its own character. The manager watched from a distance. His eyes pleaded, "Please don't cause a scene." But Jason didn't need to cause anything. The scene had already happened. He was just stepping into it, to reframe it. The billionaire kept talking, laughing like the world revolved around him. His gestures were grand, his voice trained to dominate rooms. But when he noticed Jason standing beside his table, something inside him faltered. Nothing obvious, just a slight shift in posture, like a lion suddenly catching the scent of another predator. Jason stared at him, not with anger, but with a kind of look that silently asks, "Do you realize what you've just done?" The billionaire forced a smile, trying to hold on to control. But there was something in Jason, an ancient firmness, a truth without pretense and that dismantled social defenses. Jason said nothing. Not yet. He simply let the weight of his presence fill the space between words, between glances, between silences. He looked at Daniel, who had returned to the room, eyes still downcast, like someone trying to disappear inside his own body. Jason then turned back to the table, and in that moment everyone fell silent. They didn't know what he was going to say. They didn't know if he knew the waiter. But what they felt was bigger than curiosity. It was respect, or maybe fear, possibly both. Jason took a deep breath. His chest moved with the calm of someone carrying too many stories to shout. He knew what words could do, knew that a single sentence could lift or destroy someone. So he chose his words like a surgeon chooses his blade. But it wasn't time to speak just yet. He looked once more at Daniel, and in that glance something unspoken passed between them. You matter, even if they try to make you forget it. Across the room, a young couple stopped eating. A businessman put his phone down. Even the pianist in the corner lifted his hands from the keys. Because sometimes what remains unspoken says the most. Jason stepped forward, and that was when everyone knew. The man in the corner was no longer silent. The words hadn't yet left his mouth, but the silence around him said it all. The next sentence would change everything. And Jason knew he wasn't there to confront. He was there to heal. Jason stood by the table like someone who doesn't ask for permission, but doesn't need it either. His body was steady, but his expression wasn't confrontational. It was something rarer. It was presence with purpose. The billionaire looked up, pretending to be surprised, trying to wear the same superior expression he used to dominate waiters, drivers, and even his business partners. But something was different this time, because the man standing before him didn't look disturbed. He looked inevitable. Jason didn't say good evening. He didn't ask if he could speak. Formalities had been left at the door along with the arrogance. He looked at everyone at the table, unhurried, unafraid, like someone inviting people to wake up. Faces that had just moments ago been glowing with smugness now avoided eye contact. Eyes dropped to napkins, glasses, phones. It was as if, without speaking a single word, Jason had already put up a mirror. And then, with the calm of someone who had once stood on the other side of humiliation, Jason spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was firm, and each word seemed to carry the echo of something that could no longer stay buried. It's not hard to sit in a chair like this. What's hard is remembering what it felt like when you used to mop the floor underneath it. The sentence fell like a weight across the room. The billionaire tried to laugh, but the laughter found no answer. The others didn't know where to look. And Daniel, standing just a few feet away, froze. His heart pounded. He had never heard anyone speak like that. For him, Jason continued. Most people here don't know the waiter's name, but they know the name of the wine. They don't know his mother's name, but they know the vintage. Maybe that says enough. He didn't need to point fingers. The words did that by themselves. And what made them devastating was that he wasn't speaking with anger. He was speaking with truth. And truth has a tone the ego can't ignore. Jason then said something no one expected. Before I was an actor, before any movie, any applause, I served tables too. In places like this, in worse ones. I've spilled wine. I've been called useless. I've been treated like my presence contaminated the air. And you know what hurt the most? Believing they were right. He stepped to the side like someone stepping just far enough away from pain to examine it clearly. But the problem was never the spill. It was who thought the glass mattered more than the man. The billionaire finally tried to speak. He mumbled something about not meaning to offend, that it was just a joke. But Jason didn't even look at him, because Jason wasn't speaking to him anymore. He was speaking about him. When you use words to belittle someone, you're saying more about yourself than them. You're showing that you need to hurt others to feel important. And that's not power. That's weakness dressed up as wealth. People were now really listening. This wasn't just about a rude moment in a fancy restaurant. It was about something bigger, about the whole system, about how we're taught to measure worth by status, not by character. Jason looked over at Daniel. The young man was motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't want to be the center of anything. He just wanted to disappear. But Jason saw him differently. He saw someone who needed to remember he had value. Jason turned to speak to the entire room, not with anger, but with purpose. Most people only notice the waiter when their order is late, but no one asks how long he's been on his feet, or how many dreams he had to leave behind with his coat at the door. There was silence again, a different kind this time. Not awkward, reflective. Then Jason said something that sliced through the air with precision. It's not the uniform that makes someone small. It's the gaze of those who forgot they once wore it. He looked around once more. He wasn't seeking approval. He was seeking awareness. The world doesn't need more arrogant billionaires. It needs more people who remember where they came from. The billionaire crossed his arms, trying to keep his composure, but his hands trembled just slightly, not out of fear of Jason, but because for the first time in a long time, he stood in front of someone he couldn't buy, silence, or outshine. Jason turned slowly to Daniel. The distance between them was small, but the space separating their worlds was immense, until that moment. He didn't touch Daniel, just looked him in the eyes, and said, in a voice lower now, almost intimate, "You didn't mess up by spilling a glass. They messed up by forgetting what it means to be human." Those words didn't land like compliments. They landed like rescue. Daniel felt something crack inside, like a shell of fear and shame he'd carried for too long finally starting to break. And through those cracks, Light entered. Jason knew that moment was more than a speech. It was a turning point. And then, for the first time since he'd stood up, he spoke not to the crowd but to himself. We spend our lives trying to prove we've made it, but maybe the greatest success is when we're strong enough to lift someone else up while they're still in the fight. The restaurant was no longer the same. No food would be remembered. No dish would matter. What would remain from that night were words, silences, and the healing they left behind. Jason started to walk away, leaving the table behind as if closing a chapter. But before taking the final step, he turned back. Not to Daniel, not to the billionaire, to everyone. You never know who's watching while you hurt someone, but I watched. And now, so have all of you. And with the resolve of a man who carried an entire life in his chest, he walked away. But what he left behind was heavier than any silence. Truth. But what Jason was about to say next wasn't for Daniel, nor for the billionaire. It was for himself, and it would be the sentence that would change that young waiter's life forever. The clinking of silverware had stopped. Glasses still sat on tables, but no one remembered their drink. The room, once full of superiority and rehearsed smiles, now sat in silence. The kind of silence that listens. Jason had stepped away from the billionaire's table, but he hadn't left the moment. He stood still within the space, as if waiting to complete a cycle no one else had realized existed. The manager didn't dare intervene. The diners, who thought they were the stars of the evening, now felt like supporting characters in something much greater. And Daniel remained frozen, not from fear, but from the impact. Jason turned his gaze toward the young waiter. For the first time, there were no masks between them. No uniform, no social divide, no distance. Only two people marked by the fight to survive. He took a few steps and stopped beside Daniel, who still breathed like someone coming up for air. You know, I spent a big part of my life trying to forget where I came from. The words were soft, but the whole room heard them. I wanted to forget the looks of contempt, the unspoken judgments, the times I was sized up by worn-out shoes or a thick street accent. I wanted to forget how often I felt less than, but the thing I eventually understood is that my scars are the reason I made it. Jason now looked at no one in particular, or maybe at everyone. There was one night I've never told anyone about. The room held its breath. I was 19, washing dishes in a restaurant, not even a fancy one, but the arrogance still lived in there. I was behind on rent. My mom was sick and couldn't afford medicine, and I had to smile for people who didn't even know I existed. Every order I served made me feel more invisible. Daniel listened like someone looking into a mirror they'd spent years avoiding. That night I slipped, water on the floor. A manager yelled at me in front of everyone, called me stupid, said people like me belonged on their knees. And you know what I did? Nothing. I stayed quiet, swallowed it, went back to the sink, and in that sink, between dirty water and soap, I cried. But not out of anger. I cried because I believed what he said. Jason paused for a second. That was the night I got my deepest scar. Not on my body, on my soul. No one in the room dared cough. The billionaire, once towering, now looked like something left behind. The difference between having power and having moral authority was on full display, in the form of a man speaking gently, healing people with every breath. Jason looked back at Daniel, not with pity, but with recognition. The pain you felt tonight, I know it well, and it can change you. But it's your choice. Let it harden you, or let it soften you to the world. I chose to soften, and that changed everything. Daniel's breathing shifted, no longer shallow, slower, fuller, as if he were slowly returning to himself after years of hiding. You don't need to become an actor, or be famous, or rich. But you do need to know this. No one can take your dignity from you, unless you give it away. Then Jason did something unexpected. He held out his hand. not as charity, but as respect. Daniel hesitated, out of fear, out of disbelief, out of not knowing if he deserved it. But Jason didn't lower his hand, and in that moment, in that quiet, steady moment, something passed between them. Not applause, not glory. Recognition. Two scars meeting and saying to each other, "I see you." The billionaire shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. For the first time, he looked small. Not because someone made him small, but because, without status symbols to hide behind, a person's real size shows. Jason spoke again, calm as ever. "You think money gives you power? It doesn't. It just amplifies what's already inside. If you're empty, it makes you louder. If you're insecure, it makes you more arrogant." The man had no reply, because there wasn't one. Jason stepped back and addressed the room once more. "Every one of you here has an invisible microphone. Your words, your eyes, your gestures, they all speak. And someone somewhere is listening. Maybe a child, maybe an employee, maybe a stranger. The only question is, what are they hearing from you?" The question hovered in the air like smoke. It slipped into the suits, the wine glasses, the eyes now moist with a mix of shame and clarity. Daniel tried to hold back the emotion, but he couldn't. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was a cry of release, like someone who's carried a burden so long they forgot what it felt like to breathe light. Jason stepped closer and whispered, just for him, "Pain shapes you, but it doesn't define you. What you do with it, that's who you are." The manager finally approached, ashamed, awkward. Perhaps he wanted to end the moment, move things along, cover the restaurant's embarrassment. But Jason ignored him, because in that restaurant, for one rare moment, the place had stopped being a temple for status and become an altar for healing. Daniel still trembled, but something inside him had shifted. It wasn't confidence yet, but it was possibility, a spark of something new. Jason turned, walking slowly, deliberately. He was leaving, but the moment was still open, because he carried something else he had yet to give. And that something would be more than words. It would be a turning point. But Jason knew there was still something left to do before leaving, something that didn't involve a speech but carried the same weight. And no one in that room was ready for what came next. Jason walked toward the restaurant's exit, but something in his posture said it wasn't over yet. There was a deliberate calm in each step. Not the calm of someone leaving, but of someone who still had something to deliver. The room remained silent, as if everyone were suspended in time, trying to absorb the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. The billionaire, who once owned the air around him, now looked like a poorly placed painting in a luxury frame. He was still there, but no one was looking anymore. Jason paused by the host stand. Daniel, still caught between disbelief and emotion, watched him from across the room. His body was present, but his mind was drifting through the words he'd heard, the eyes that had looked at him, and the weight of a moment that had undone something inside him, but also rebuilt it. Jason looked at the manager. The man hesitated, guilt tugging at his expression. Jason leaned in, whispered something brief, then nodded in Daniel's direction. Not entirely sure what was happening, the manager gave Daniel a short wave. It wasn't the same kind of gesture from earlier. This one had uncertainty in it. Daniel walked forward slowly, like someone afraid the invitation might vanish. Jason turned to face him. His eyes carried no pity, no charity, only intention. "You think tonight was the end, don't you?" His words were soft. They didn't push. They opened. Daniel didn't respond. He just breathed, carefully, like someone adjusting to a new altitude. "But maybe it's the beginning." Jason reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn card, folded in half, the edges bent, something clearly carried around for years. He held it out. "Someone gave me this back when I had nothing. A man who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. At the time, I thought, who am I to deserve this? But now I get it. Daniel took the card with trembling fingers. He didn't open it right away. He just stared at it like a fragile relic. There's an address on there, a name. It's a production company. Real people. They don't care about fame. They care about purpose. They've got programs, coaching, second chances. It's not about acting. It's about building something. Jason placed a hand gently on Daniel's shoulder. I want you to go. The restaurant watched, hushed. No phones, no movement, just stillness. The kind that means something. Jason turned fully toward Daniel now, his voice lower, but with a new edge, something deeper. You're already someone. You just forgot. Tonight reminded you. Jason turned to leave, but before walking away, he looked back at the billionaire, not with anger, but with something harder to face, compassion. You've still got time to change, but it starts with the mirror, not your bank account. And then he walked away. Daniel stood there, still holding the card. The room around him slowly came back into motion. Forks moved again, chairs adjusted, murmurs returned. But for Daniel, something had shifted forever. He looked around the restaurant, not with shame, but with new eyes. The same lights now looked dimmer, not because they'd faded, but because the real light had come from somewhere else entirely. Outside, the cold London air hit his face as he stepped into the night. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't cinematic. It was human. The card still in his hand, the weight of words still in his chest, the memory of someone who had no reason to help him, but chose to. He sat on a nearby bench under a flickering streetlight. He unfolded the card. There was a name, an address, and on the back, in Jason's handwriting, you don't have to be perfect, just willing. Daniel smiled, not with glee, but with recognition. Somewhere in the city, Jason walked alone, hands in his pockets. No reporters, no cameras, no applause. But inside, something had been healed. Because sometimes when you lift someone else, you end up saving yourself too. That night, Daniel wouldn't return home the same. And what he would choose to do the next day wouldn't just change his life. It would change the lives of others who, like him, only needed to be seen. The next morning, London was the same. Gray, damp, impatient. Buses hissed through puddles. Steam drifted from manholes, and people moved with the same distracted urgency as always. The city had no idea what had happened the night before at the Élysée. But Daniel did. He woke up before the alarm. His eyes stung, not from exhaustion but from something else. Expectation. The night before still felt unreal, like a dream misfiled into reality. But the card was real, still folded in his coat pocket, still there, with the same address, the same name, the same sentence scribbled on the back. You don't have to be perfect, just willing. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor the same way he'd stared at life for months, with quiet fear, like stepping into a world that had no room for him. But that day, he stood with intention. No dramatic gesture. He still felt afraid, still doubted himself, still heard that voice in his head whispering, "You don't belong." But he tied his shoes, stared into the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, he saw a possibility. The address led to a modest building on the other side of the city. No glass walls, no gold lettering. Just a quiet entrance, worn steps, and walls lined with framed photos of everyday people. People who had stories, people who had been seen. He walked in. A silver-haired woman behind a desk greeted him with a warm smile and offered him tea, as if she'd been waiting for him, and maybe she had. Jason had called, not to pull strings, but to open a door. What followed was a journey Daniel never imagined. It wasn't about acting or film or fame. It was about rediscovery. Workshops, coaching, conversations that broke walls he didn't know he had. It wasn't about performance, it was about truth. He learned that before you can tell your story, you have to hear it yourself. Before you can speak, you have to remember your own voice. Before you can rise, you have to believe you deserve to stand. Meanwhile, a video from that night, recorded discreetly by a guest, began spreading online. Jason standing, speaking, touching Daniel's shoulder. There was no filter, no dramatic edit, just truth, caught raw and unpolished. And that's what made it explode. Millions of views, thousands of shares, people posting things like, "This is the kind of man the world needs." More Jason Stathams, please. Real power isn't loud, it's human. News outlets tried to reach out, shows wanted interviews. Jason stayed quiet. He didn't chase the spotlight. Because what happened at the Élysée wasn't content, it was healing. The Élysée restaurant quietly made changes. The billionaire didn't return. Management offered ethics training. Staff pay increased. No one asked Jason to do that, and Daniel never demanded it. Truth moved it. The kind of truth that doesn't need hashtags. It moves in silence. 2 months later, Daniel was invited to speak at a small internal event at the studio. Just a circle of others like him. Safe space. No lights. No cameras. He was terrified. His shirt was simple but crisp. There was no tie, no uniform. Just Daniel and his voice. He shared his story, slowly, with long pauses. His eyes watered more than once, but he didn't run, didn't shrink. He stood in front of a group of strangers and told the truth. At the end, no one clapped. Not out of apathy, but out of reverence. In the back of the room, someone stood up. Daniel saw him before anyone else. Jason was there. No spotlight, no announcement. Just there. Daniel locked eyes with him, then looked down, overcome. Jason nodded, a small gesture, but Daniel understood it clearly. You did it. After the event, Jason approached, not with fanfare, not with ego, just the same quiet strength he'd always had. Remember what I said about pain and purpose? Daniel nodded. You just proved it. Jason grabbed a napkin from the coffee table, scribbled something, folded it, and handed it over. Keep it. And when you meet someone who's where you used to be, give it to them. Daniel unfolded it. It read, You don't have to be perfect, just willing. Same words. But this time, in his handwriting, they looked at each other one last time. No ceremony, no dramatic goodbye, just understanding. Jason left as he always did, quietly. Daniel stayed, but not as the invisible boy who once shook behind a tray. He stayed as someone who would carry the flame forward. Months later, Daniel was offered a job assisting on set, then production assistant, then creative lead on a new short film series. He pitched an idea. Real stories. From real people. Moments that changed lives. Not with money, not with power, but with presence. The first episode? Table by the Wall, the night that changed everything. He never named the billionaire, because the story wasn't about humiliation, it was about transformation. Some say heroes wear capes, others say they shout loud and shine bright. But sometimes, the real hero is the man who sits in the corner, speaks when it matters most, and then disappears. Jason didn't save the world that night. He saved one. And that was more than enough. And on the night arrogance tried to shine, it was humility that lit the whole room. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that there's still light out there. And if you've ever been a Daniel or a Jason, leave a comment. Tell us your story. Don't forget to click the like button so YouTube understands what you like to see here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more stories like this. See you next time.